Java is made up of many components. One of them is a constructor. So what is a constructor? A constructor in Java is a special type of method that is used to initialize the object. A Java constructor is invoked at the time of object creation. As it constructs values, that is, as it provides data for the object, it is referred to as constructor. A constructor looks like a method, but is not a method. All methods have return type, but constructors don't have any return type. There are basically two rules defined for the constructor. A constructor name must be same as its class name, and a constructor must have no explicit return type. There are two types of constructors: default constructor or no argument constructor, and parameterized constructor. Let's begin with default constructor and understand it with the help of an example. Default constructor refers to a constructor that is automatically created by compiler in the absence of explicit constructors. You can also call a constructor without parameters as default constructor because all of its instance variables are set to default values. Let's take a look at an example of default constructor. Next is parameterized constructor. Parameterized constructor refers to a constructor with argument list. They take input parameters on creation of objects. If we define only parameterized constructors, then we cannot create an object with default constructor. Displayed on screen is an example of parameterized constructor. Let's view another example. Now if we replace the code of public static void main with another code, the answer is 77. Why? While creating an object, we have passed 77 as a parameter inside parenthesis. Hence, instead of default constructor, the parameterized constructor with integer argument gets invoked, in which we have assigned the argument value to the variable. If we don't define the constructor within the class, will the compiler declare a constructor every time? The answer is yes. Consider this example. It will throw a compilation error. Because, if you don't define any constructor in your class, the compiler provides a default one for you. However, if you declare any constructor, the compiler will not do it for you. Since we have already defined a constructor in above code, compiler didn't create the default constructor. While creating objects, we are invoking default one, which doesn't exist in above code. That's why the code gives a compilation error. Here are a few more points about constructors. Every class has a constructor, whether it's normal one or an abstract class. As stated above, constructors are not methods, and they don't have any return type. Constructor name and class name should be the same. Constructor can use any access specifier. They can be declared as private as well. Private constructors are possible in Java, but their scope is within the class only. Like constructors, methods can also have same name as class name, but they still have return type, through which we can differentiate them as methods, and not as constructors. If you don't define any constructor within the class, compiler will do it for you, and it will create a no argument or default constructor for you. Default constructors do not contain any parameters. Default constructors are created only if there are no constructors defined by us. If this, or super needs to be used inside the constructor, then they should be the first statement in the constructor code. If you don't mention them, compiler does it for you accordingly. Constructor overloading is possible, but overriding is not possible. which means we can have overloaded constructor in our class, but we can't override a constructor. Constructors cannot be inherited. If the superclass doesn't have a no-argument or default constructor, then the compiler will not create a default constructor in the child class, and hence, the developer has to provide an explicit constructor in the child class. Interfaces do not have constructors. Abstract class can have constructors, and these will get invoked when a class, which extends the abstract class, gets instantiated, that is, object creation of concrete class. A constructor can also invoke another constructor of the same class by using this. If you want to invoke an argument constructor, then use this parameter list. Moving on to next topic. We shall now discuss about Java constructor overloading. Just like method overloading, we can overload constructors also. Along with default constructor, we can have constructors with parameters. The number of parameters can be same, and it can have different data types. Let's take a look at an example that displays the sample code for constructor overloading. The purpose of private constructor is to serve singleton classes. A singleton class is one, which limits the number of objects creation to one. Using private constructor, we can ensure that no outside class can have access to constructor to create an object. To limit object creation to only one, we create static method inside the class, which will have access to private constructor. Displayed here is an example that shows how to use private constructor for limiting the number of objects for a singleton class.